and science of storytelling. My name is Bennett. I am your host, and I'm a filmmaker and an author on a quest to understand how we can tell better stories so that we can do better work and make the world a better place. Each episode, I host one of the world's best storytellers to help you understand how to leverage storytelling to increase your sales, deepen your connections, and serve your audiences better. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode, and I hope that you love it. Sunyi, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Ray.
Better late than never, right?
Yeah.
A little bit of
Things
technical.
always happen.
Things always happen. I love that perspective. So far in our short time of knowing one another, you've told me you're an open book, and that shit happens. So I like you already, pal, and I appreciate your flexibility. Let's go ahead and get into it since we are a little bit behind. Appreciate you being here. There's a lot that I want to talk to you about. Since Heather introduced us, which I love Heather. I had seen some of your stuff from Stephen Pressfield, who we've both had on our respective shows. And so that's the first time I saw your handsome face and started to listen to the way that you view, the world and the work that you do in it. So I'm excited to dive into it. There's a lot of different things that you do. My first question is, I'm always interested in, I see our lives and our work as kind of these little cycles. And if you're doing it right, it's in a constant state of evolution. So my first question is there something that you're trying to change, grow, get better at currently in order to continue to achieve that evolution?
Yeah, like right now, I think I'm just doubling down on teaching. I just recently discovered in the past couple of years that my calling is to really teach. So like 2 years ago, I put out this course called The Art of Storytelling for freelance creators and freelancers. And now it has over like 28,000 students. And at that time, 2 years ago, I'm like, I'm the shit when it comes to storytelling. Like I'm going to teach this. But then over the last 2 years, I've been teaching in my own community, and every week I'm learning. I'm like, like I'll teach something and I'm like, they didn't get that. So I'll try something else. So right now, I feel like that's kind of my main thing. I want to learn how to teach storytelling. And every week I'm learning something new.
I love that you said that. Are you familiar with James Altucher?
Yeah.
He said it one time. I believe it was
the curly hair guy, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think he said it on his show one time, where it's like you learn in 3 different ways. You learn from someone better than you or more experienced than you, will say, right? From a teacher, mentor, etc. You learn from your peers, people on the same level, but you also learn from people with less experience than you, which is exactly what you're conveying right there. And I 100% agree. I've been a teacher in some capacity my whole life because I've enjoyed it, whether I'm teaching soccer or fitness or storytelling. I love it. I absolutely love it. Now, here's one thing that I don't struggle with personally, but I want to hear your perspective on it. You know, the old cliche, like those who can't do, teach. Well, I would argue that you and I are both people that do and teach. How do you navigate those two worlds where they're maybe helping each other and not, hurting each other, for lack of a better word?
Can you elaborate? What do you mean by like?
So let's talk about the differences, just because I think that's something that people get wrong all the time, that you can't be passionate or effective as a teacher and also someone who's out there actively doing the thing. Or some people say that if you're out there creating courses and teaching, like, that's because that's your skill. That's what you have to offer. You're not actually doing the thing, but you are, right? You have a branding agency. So that's kind of what I'm trying to dig into, because I think it's a flawed perspective. And I'm one that has always tried to ride that line. And just for someone else who might be out there thinking, like, I really do, like, I think I could teach. Like, how do you navigate that when you have your company and then you also have your educational platform, we'll call it?
Yeah, I don't see those two as kind of contradicting at all. Like for me, I don't know about like what kind of storytelling you teach mainly. The type of storytelling that I teach is mainly for marketing. So because first of all, I just want to preface that, like, I think there's a very difference between storytelling for art, like literature, writing like novels, movies or screenplays or whatnot, versus like storytelling for marketing, which is what I do. And I think they're two very different things. So I'm not really like the storytelling for art part is not my area of expertise. I don't
Got
claim
it.
to know that and things like that, right? Like my thing is mostly marketing storytelling. And when it comes to that, I feel like the ones that say those who can't do teach, I think that's bullshit. Like from what I realized, you in order to teach something well, yeah, I mean you can yeah, I can teach. Somebody can know like I can learn I can know how to tie a shoe and I can teach, but that doesn't mean you're gonna be a good teacher, right? And for me, what I found is like in order to teach something, you have to know way more. Like it's kind of like, I do yoga and when you go to yoga studio and I'm like struggling with the pose or something like that, the teacher will come and just like lightly tap my back or something like that. And then I'm like, holy shit, like they see things that I don't see at all. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And I think that's kind of how teaching is. Like I said, over the last 2 years, I learned so much deeper about storytelling that I didn't realize. Even because I think it's one thing for me to know how to do it intuitively. I know that if I use this word or if I say it like this or if I use this image, intuitively I'm like, oh, that feels right.
Hmm.
But what's actually going on in my brain? Like if I reverse engineering, why is that image work better than why is this word work better than this? Like I have to actually reverse engineer it and find out my analytical thinking and the process of how I came to that decision so that I can teach somebody else to replicate it, right? Otherwise,
Hmm.
I can't teach my intuitive thinking. You know what I mean?
I think it's wise to approach it as, you know, thinking, teaching, and learning all overlapping and bundled together because I think that that's life and they're not compartmentalized or segmented like that. Do you think that one of the ways that teaching has helped you learn is because you're working with different people from different backgrounds with different perspectives, and so you might be seeing that your way is not the only way, for example? Is that a piece of it? I'm just
Not
speculating.
necessarily.
Okay.
Do you mainly work with like writers and like people who write books, things like that?
Sometimes, yeah, sometimes, not mainly.
Okay. Or so you work with entrepreneurs and so you're using story for telling for marketing and stuff like
Mhm.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I only teach my way of storytelling, which I think is very specific.
Mm.
And but what I'm really learning, but I agree with you that everybody tells different types of stories and things like that. Um, and I think like writers workshops and things like that are really great for that. I'm actually trying to teach my specific way of storytelling, which I think is like a tiny slice of the storytelling market. But you're definitely right. It's because there's so many like so we have like freelancers and we have coaches and we have like product based business owners. So different type of businesses and also they all have different life experience, and they're all at different levels. So
Yeah.
one of the things that I'm learning the most is like for example, like I'll teach a concept of uh, like one of the concepts I'll teach is like in your story, depending on how you tell your story, you can come off as a hero, but you can also come off as either a victim or villain. And when I teach that and I have them do an exercise, and next week I'll see it and I'm like, okay, oh shit, like 70% of people didn't get that. So how can I say this better? And then I'll say it different and I'll say, okay, if you don't have an inner transformation, there's no story. And I see how they do it, and I'm like, okay, they didn't get that. So I have to keep coming up with prompts and coming up with
Mm.
like saying it in a different way to make them understand it. And that's like for me is like the hardest part because I'll explain how to do something and certain percentage of people got it and but the other ones didn't.
Yeah.
So I'm like, how can I say this better so that these people will get it too? Like that's what I'm struggling with.
Absolutely. What's your background? I know you've had Night Owl for quite a while. But what about when you were younger?
So I started making websites
Mm.
when I first learned HTML in 19. So I started pretty young. But my background, I started as like coding and
Mm.
then I learned design so that I started coding like just HTML websites. and then I learned design so that I can put something on it. And then I started like getting into that. So I've been doing web design for like 20 years. But then in the last 10 years, I also like kind of merged. I wanted to be a filmmaker, so I
Oh,
went to film school at night, and then I merged like copywriting, so I have like so many different uh, skills when it comes to within the web design, right? Design, coding,
yeah.
film, photography, like copywriting. All of them is kind of part of websites. And I never saw myself as a storyteller at all, actually. Even when I first started on Instagram 4 years ago, I just was going to teach marketing and design and things like that. But then people kept commenting, but like, son, can you teach me? Like, you're such a great storyteller. Can you teach me how to story? I'm like, what? And then, like 2 years into it, I got a call from Domestica saying, hey, can you create a course for us on storytelling? I'm like, okay, fine. And I made that. And that's the course that got like 28,000 students.
Mhm.
And then ever since then, I'm like, I guess I'm a storyteller. And I started like branding myself as like a storytelling teacher.
What do you think led to that Domestica course? What did you have, like a viral post, or how did they hear about you?
Yeah, like my Instagram grew pretty fast in the beginning because I made these carousels. I
Mhm.
call them so this is one of the type of story, like majority of the type of storytelling that I teach is I call it myth truth sandwich. So I start with a myth, and then I give them an example that proves that myth wrong, and then I give them the truth, right? So that is kind of the basis of what I teach, and all my carousels are made like that. And then so those all of those carousels did like were doing really well. So I grew pretty quickly, and then I think that's how they found me.
Mm.
I didn't even realize that that was storytelling because
Yeah.
it's just the way I communicate, right? Like when I talk to my employees, like when I'm trying to convince somebody to do anything, right, sell them on an idea or anything like that, I just realized that they're not getting it. So one of the first things I started doing is like, okay, let me put myself in their shoes. Why are they not getting? Okay, oh, that's because they still believe in this myth that I used to believe. So that's why I start from the myth, and then I realized like I'll go into a meeting in front of my employees and I'll say something, and I'll at the end I'll say like any questions, and nobody raises their hand, right? like like normally. So I'm like, okay, everyone got this, and then like a week later, I found out that
Yeah,
nobody got it, right?
exactly.
so so what I started doing is every time I say something, I give an advice or make a statement, I'll follow with for example, and then I kept giving examples. And after I give the example, they're like, oh, I get it now. So I can
Mhm.
actually literally see in their eyes that when I give an example, like when I make a statement, they don't understand. But then when I say, for example, then they understand. And then finally, like I'll give the lesson, and that kind of became how I communicate in general. So when I went on Instagram, I started making those carousels. Subconsciously, I was doing that without knowing, and then I guess people call that storytelling.
Well, it is. I mean, and that's to your point earlier, is like saying that you don't do literature and that sort of stuff. I mean, storytelling is communication. There are a million different ways to tell stories. So it is a storytelling framework. I'm curious, why do you think the carousels hit so hard for you? You're a well-spoken guy. You're passionate about what you do. So maybe a two-part question: why did you actively choose that route, and why do you think that they land so well?
I think it's multiple things. So at first, I was actually what I was doing was I was taking. So here's an example of something that I would tell my clients, right? When I'm in sales or something like that, I'll say, like most companies do, they have designers and copywriters, right?
Mhm.
And they're kind of separate. So like the copywriter will write the copy, hand it off to the designer. Designer's like, okay, let me make this pretty, and that's what they think
Yeah.
web design is. And I told them, no, it's not. Like the art and copy has to work together to tell a story. And and then I'll say, for example, when you look at a meme, like when you look at the meme of that little baby dick that's going like, yes, right? Like that's the art that says something. And then the copy would say something like, oh, I was late to work and boss was even later. Yes, right? So when you see the art, when you see an internet meme, when you see that the picture with the copy together, it says something much more than just the copy alone or the art alone, right? And I would explain that concept like, it's like, for example, and then I'll use the meme as an example. And then so so I would say that in a Zoom call, let's say, and then I'll take a recording of that and post it on Instagram. And that didn't really do well. But then I don't know if you know Chris Do.
Yeah,
Have you heard of Chris Do? Yeah.
sure.
So I saw that he was making all these carousels, like kind of like almost like a PowerPoint presentation. I'm like, that's cool. So I started copying that, and then so I think it's first the myth truth sandwich that I was talking about,
Mhm.
and then when I started doing carousel, it didn't perform as well, but I kept rewriting and rewriting and rewriting it to make it shorter, like just intuitive from because I do web design, I know that people don't read, so
Mm.
I was shorten it, shorten it, shorten it. So I was known for like making really concise carousels with just like short sentences that proves the point, right? And ever since I kept doing that, what happened was I saw these comments on Instagram. People will say, "Oh, I never thought of it that way." Like I'll talk about the meme thing, right? Or I'll give here's another one. Here's a one I did recently. I'll do something like everybody says, "Oh, just like you don't need a niche like you're like I'm multi-passionate entrepreneur or whatever it is, right?" And then I give an example like Leonardo da Vinci. The reason why um, like he was a chemist, so he knew how to use mixed colors that'll come up with paint color that's like realistic skin tones that nobody else had. He was also a biologist, so he understand the anatomy and he can draw more realistic figures of the human. And being a chemist and a biologist actually made him a better painter. And so that's why. And then at the end I finish it by saying like, you know, you can be multi-passionate, you can have multiple niches, but you're still going to be known for one niche. So when I post something like that, people will comment like, "Oh, I never thought of it that way." And that saying is something that I've heard throughout my life, like because I will go into a meeting with clients and they'll be like, "Oh, I never thought of it that way," or my employees will say the same thing. So I didn't really think too much about it, but after seeing that comment a few times, I just made that my tagline, my slogan. So at the end of the carousel, I would always put, "I never thought of it that way." And then that really caught on, and people are like, "Son, like I know a lot of companies, a lot of brands have slogans, but your slogan really represents you perfectly." So I think that's kind of like what I became known for, to make people say, "I never thought of it that way."
So much of what you're talking about is landing on empathy, right? Just understanding the people that you're talking to and listening, right? Taking, making adjustments, pivoting when you need to based on the response. Um, Out of the carousels or in general storytelling tips, what have you noticed are the tips that resonate the most, or what types of tips? Because different platforms perform different ways, right? What might
Yeah.
hit on LinkedIn doesn't hit on TikTok. Have you noticed certain ones that you can now pretty accurately predict which ones will
N-
hit or resonate?
Well, one thing I'll tell you for sure is that people make the content way too complicated. So for me, one pattern I notice is like whenever I say something kind of mediocre, like something that's way too complex, never does well. And then
Mhm.
I'll say I'll create something simple. And I'm like, "Oh, everyone knows this," and I'll post it, and that's the one that does well.
Mm.
And I think it's because a lot of times we're experts, so the things that are like awesome to us, only like expert level people understand that. The mainstream audience just won't understand that. So we actually have to talk about something that we're like few years back, right?
Mhm.
The thing that's cliche to us. When you post that, that's the thing, because like they've never heard that before. Even we've
Dude,
heard it a million times, but they've
yes.
never. Yeah.
It's so good. That's so true. It's like the comics, right? Like to make a stand-up comic laugh, you really got to like do
Yeah.
something outlandish because this is what they do all the time. They're the hardest to make laugh. That's what it makes me think of.
Yeah,
You
that's
know?
true.
You know what I'm talking about? So when they're in a room together, like to get a laugh out of that crowd, you gotta be top tier because the basic jokes they've heard a million times,
Yeah.
a million different ways. I really think that's a good po I've seen that too in my own content. Like, I'm
Yeah,
trying
I
to
was
think
curious
about
what works for you. Yeah.
oh, I mean, I think that's pretty spot on, not to just piggyback that easily, but now that I'm thinking about it, like I to my own detriment perhaps, think about like, oh, what's a fresh take or not a fresh take, but like what's something new they haven't heard of, right? That I'm
Mm-mm-mm.
still nerding out about because I just learned
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
But you're 100% right. If I look back at Rain, from 2021, like what would advice when he was writing his first book, what would
Yeah.
help him at that point? I think you're spot on about that. And we play those tricks on ourselves in our head of like you just said, like everybody knows this, they won't
Yeah.
care, and that's one that hits. And then otherwise, on the flip side, we try to add too much information, and it just tanks. They don't read.
Yeah. Yeah. So true.
It is so true, man. I have that conversation all the time.
I would say, like, if you want to be platform specific,
Hmm.
um, what I noticed works well on the writing platforms like Threads, LinkedIn,
Hmm.
are actually the really authentic, vulnerable stories. Like, even if they're longer, like if you just come from the heart, because like a lot of people I feel like don't write their stories from the heart. They write from what's gonna make me look good, right?
Hmm.
And those never really do well. Like for me, it's the ones where I have to be super vulnerable, talk about my flaws, talk about my shortcomings, my weaknesses, the embarrassing stuff that I've done. Those are usually the ones that hit the most.
I totally agree with that. I have seen that in my own journey as well. 100%. 100%. When you were talking earlier about what really clicks for people is when you give them the example. The information never lands, maybe a percentage of the way or for a percentage of the people, but until you show them, show don't tell, right?
Yeah.
They don't hit it. In a lot of my workshops, what I've noticed is I'll teach them storytelling, yada yada yada. I'll give them examples, and then when I say, okay, tell me a story with this framework about this topic, it's like crickets, right?
Mm-mm-mm-mm.
They can't do it. And I've noticed that enough to where I know that application and practice and the workshops being interactive is imperative. It's crucial because learning and doing are two different things. I think, even though they're married together. So along the way, you created the Night Owl Nation, right? This community that you have. That's what I want to dig into because, from my experience, that's what I was trying to illustrate there. Like the being together, practicing together, learning from one another is so huge to progress, right? So first of all, why did you start that community? I want to dive into the importance of it, but I'm also curious why all of a sudden one day you're like, you know what I'm gonna do?
Yeah. I Since I started, I've also learned a lot. So I'll kind of start from the beginning. So 2 years ago, when I reached maybe 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, when I reached like a certain number of followers, I'm like, okay, I people are like, can you create a course? Can you create a course? So I was about to create a course. I was going to do the whole sales page webinar, that whole 9 yards. But every time I write my cop sales page, I felt like I was lying. I felt like I was lying to myself. I felt icky because I kept saying, okay, this is, I'm going to teach storytelling that's going to help you grow your Instagram and things like that. But in the back of my head, I knew it wasn't true. Like, I knew that I can teach this course. First of all, a lot of my clients sell courses. So I
Mm-hmm.
know the numbers, right? Like, I knew that about 70% of the people are not even going to finish the course. And even out of the 30% that do finish the course, like 90% of them are not even going to actually take action and write something and practice it, right? Which is the important part, actually putting out content. So I knew that unless they're actually practicing is where you're really learning. And because subconsciously I knew that. So that's why I kind of like, I went into a hole and I disappeared from Instagram for like 9 months. And I just, at that moment, I actually felt like my whole life was a lie. I'm like, oh, shit, is this what I've been doing? Like, is my entire career based on manipulating people to buy these things that's
Mm.
not gonna work? And like, I went through like an existential crisis. And during that 9 months, like both my mom and my sister are professors. So I've been like talking to them, and we've been discussing like what's the best way to teach. We talked about like why online courses don't work and all of those things. And the main thing was, yeah, like it's not going to work unless they're doing the work. And the problem with online courses is, they did a test with like a, a professor giving a lecture in the lecture hall, and in the next room, like same thing, all the students were there, but instead of the professor being there, it was a screen of live stream of their professor showing it here. And there was a huge discrepancy in the what they learned in that classroom. And my sister said there's a big difference because just the presence of the teacher matters, that somebody is there. It's some sort of a kind of accountability thing. Like if the teacher is not there, they're not paying attention, they're on their phone or whatever it is, right? So anyway, for 9 months, like we kind of talked about it, and eventually I came to the conclusion that I need to create a community, and the focus has to be the practice, not the learning, but the practice. So, and I grew up in the church, so like I remember we would go to small groups, and I love going to small groups, hanging out with my friends. So I wanted to make it fun, so we created small groups. So um, we have small groups within the community. We have small group volunteer, small group leaders, and every week they meet together. So every Sunday, I call it Sunday service. Every
Uh-huh.
Sunday I teach and I give them a storytelling prompt, and then throughout the week they meet in small groups and they share their stories and they give feedback and they practice like that. So yeah, that's kind of like one of the main reasons why I started a community rather than a course.
Take them to church, son. That is hilarious. I grew up in the church as well. Just thinking about you, that inspiring you to break out small groups. Oh man, that's good stuff. You posted something recently. This is aligned with what you were talking about, just that icky feeling. And I've
Mhm.
been dealing with my own version of this week. And I saw a post where you were talking about just honesty, in sales and pitching, just your
Mhm.
perspective on that. Can we talk a little bit about that when you're a lot of the people that listen here are, if not freelancers, they're contract workers, they're entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, small businesses, creators, etc. Um, can you talk to me a little bit about your philosophy with that? It sounds like it's aligned with the same things that led you to this community.
Yeah, I'm always like a firm believer of, because like I've been a marketer my whole life, so I know how to sell stuff. Like you can bring me the most garbage product and I'll sell it. But the thing is, that's the part I guess I didn't really realize what I was doing, right? So now kind of my philosophy is I can sell the shit out of anything, but the but I think the difference is, does your product work or not, right? Like cuz I see a lot of people like selling a product and over promising,
Mm.
and I'm not a big fan of that. So for me, like when I sell hard, but I'm also going to make sure that the product works. So and I it's not really about um I can talk about this forever. Like first of all, I have no problem with selling something that that most people don't think is valuable. For example, if you sell a Chanel bag, like Chanel bags are $10,000, right? And millions of people have bought that bag, right?
Hmm.
And I might be looking at them like that's a scam. Like that bag didn't cost them more than $100 to make, and they're selling it for $10,000, right? But it did provide a value for that person who bought it. No, does that make sense? Like a $1.5 million Bugatti, even though in my opinion it's a waste of money, it's like a scam in my opinion. But for the person that bought it, it did provide a value for that person, whether that's like a feeling or whatever it is, right? So as long as I think what I believe is ethical is you have to be honest with the you have to be honest with the audience. For me, I actually say in my sales page, like, if you're not willing to spend 2 to 4 hours a week, don't even bother joining because it's not going to work for you.
Mm.
So I think as long as I'm honest, then I have no problem selling hard. You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Absolutely. I mean, transparency and honesty is everything. And if it doesn't work out, then we couldn't agree to terms. It doesn't have to be this terrible like fallout, right?
Yeah,
And it's not there's not alignment, and that's okay for that day. But
yeah.
um I
I
think one of
also
the
try not to. One of the things that I hear a lot is like selling the result, right? But
Mhm.
I try not to sell the result unless there's actually a result, right? So, because a lot of people do that, right? They're like, oh, after this course, you're gonna walk over, you're gonna learn how to make $1 million or whatever it is,
Right,
right?
right, right.
But if that's not the norm, that if that's not the case for most of your customers, then you're actually manipulating the truth, right?
Yeah. So what do you focus on instead?
I focus on like the actual skill that they're gonna learn. So
Mm.
not the like for example, like I try not to say this is how many followers you're gonna get, or you're gonna get more followers, you're gonna make more money. Like I'm gonna teach you storytelling skills. What you do with TED is up to you. It's kind of like when you buy a course on how to use Photoshop, or you know what I mean. It's like it's
Yeah.
more like a skill that you're learning. Not I'm not I'm not. It's not a get rich quick scheme.
Yeah, and I'm starting to get the picture really clearly now because of how you approach things. It's just very straight up. It's not manipulative, but it also to me it ties back to when you were in the beginning of the conversation talking about like, look, I just teach my way of storytelling.
Hmm.
I'm not teaching this, I'm not teaching that. Like this is what I'm giving you. This is what it costs. This is what it requires of you. And I know that this is kind of vague the way I'm putting it, but I think that straightforwardness and just simplicity is key. And I
Yeah.
think it's refreshing for people to clearly know, like, okay, this is what it is. Here's what it costs. Here's what's
I
expected of
think if
me.
you know how to really sell using
Yeah. Yeah.
storytelling, you can be completely honest. You don't have to manipulate, do none of those. Be completely like ethical and honest, and still be convincing.
Yeah.
Do you understand what I mean?
Absolutely. I mean, the similar event that I had this week that made me interested in this question specifically was a speaking gig offer that was way way low, but I had reasons to be interested in it, and I just had a conversation. I just said, "Hey, here's where I normally start. I know you want to keep costs down. You're a nonprofit, but I need to get closer to that rate. So, what are some creative ways that we could bring more value to you and your audience at the event in order to do that?" So, it wasn't me trying to convince you of this. It's me just having an open conversation, and that's why that resonated with me so much that you said. And I booked it at 400% of their initial offer. I'm doing more work for that,
Yeah.
but I'm not spending more time, and it's everybody is winning. And I painted the picture. I told I used story to show them, like, look, this is what we're doing, like a book signing, like a meet and greet. I'm like, this is what your audience would get out of it. So it works. It exactly
Yeah.
works. But we're told so much that, like you said, sell the result, and it's all manipulative, and that does give that
You
icky.
also it sounds like you also like you said before about empathy. You saw it from their perspective
Yeah, you
and
got
saw
to.
like how can we work together? How can we come up with a creative solution to make this
Yeah.
work? So you saw like you weren't just pushing your
No,
agenda.
and that's exactly it. And the takeaway, it's funny that you said, I'm sorry, like everything you're saying is like resonating with me. You said something earlier about people encouraging you to do the course and teach storytelling. Well, I made a post about this thing I'm telling you about, and people started asking me to do more material on that because I said something along the lines of like negotiating is easy when everybody wins. So find the
Mm.
way that
Oh
everybody
yeah,
can leave happy. And
I
multiple
love that.
people said, do more on that. And I was like, oh, I didn't ever even think about doing something about that
Mm.
topic, but it is because they reached out to me. The job was mine for the taking. So I knew they wanted me. And most people view it as binary, like take less than I feel like I deserve or stand my ground and risk losing the job, which I'm also interested in getting. And it's not binary. There's a whole world of possibility there
Mm.
in the middle. And we found a creative way to do it so the audience
Yeah.
gets more value, the team gets more bang for their buck, and I get paid, what I need to
Yeah.
get paid to do it. So yeah, I had to think about it from their perspective, or it wouldn't
They could
work.
probably feel that too. That oh, this person actually really cares about our
Absolutely.
agenda
I
too.
called
Yeah.
them directly. They
Yeah.
left their phone number in the signature of the email. I called them immediately. To me, I
Mhm.
like just kind of being there, kind of like the teacher example, and
Mhm.
not just words on a screen saying like, "I'd really like $5,000." How do you think that would have landed?
Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
know, like that's they'd be like,
That
"Sorry."
actually, you'd be surprised how many meetings I go to where somebody's trying to sell to me, and it's almost like they're not even listening to me. Like
Yeah,
they're
yeah,
talking about the awards they won and blah blah blah, all of those things. Like they're like, "Oh, we work with this client, blah blah blah." They're like they're selling,
bro.
but it feels like they're not listening to me, right? And from my experience, I think the best sales meetings are the ones where they feel like they actually care about me and they're listening,
Yeah.
right?
It's a relationship. What
Yeah,
you just said,
yeah,
like it feels like you're not listening to me. Yeah,
yeah,
that
yeah.
sucks and that
I'm not
hurts.
gonna hire you if
No.
like I'm gonna hire you and you're just gonna ignore me. So like why would I hire you? Yeah.
Oh my god. All right, one thing I'm excited to talk to you about
Mm.
is you clearly have your in terms of your work, your foot in the kind of company corporate space as well as the personal branding space. So I'd like to dive into that a little bit if that's okay. And
We
it,
moved away a lot from the
did you?
corporate space.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, what I was going to ask you, son, is I want to discuss the and we can still do this even though
Yeah.
you're moving away.
Yeah.
I'd be curious to why, of
Yeah.
course,
Okay. Yeah.
but I was going to ask you about the similarities in terms of storytelling for marketing for between both, as well as the differences.
Mhm.
And then, like I said, I'd love to know why you're making that decision to move away.
I think there's like only a handful of storytelling that you can do in business. Like like obviously the most popular one is the hero's journey, right?
Hmm.
Um, but I think that really only works if it's like I know like like start with why and all of that. Like from my experience, I found that people don't really care about the founder story as much as they think, unless the founder story helps them in some way, the
Yeah,
audience in some way. So like in Shark Tank, that's why I think in Shark Tank it works, because in Shark Tank, if you look at the ones that get the funding, it's usually the ones that have the best stories. And it's always a story like this, like, oh, I was struggling with this, and I looked for the product that does this everywhere, but it's like I couldn't find anything, and none of it really worked. And I said to myself, there's got to be a better way. And then like I invented this product, and once I
yep,
did it, everybody started asking for it, and that's kind of so that story I think works perfectly. Like it's a great hero's journey story, right? But not all business has that story. There are plenty of business that doesn't have that inventor
yeah,
journey. I call it the inventor's journey story. um, and for those, I think what Cherry Water does is really good. They use the story of their customers, and I think if you tell the story of their customer, then people can relate to it. The hero's journey story works so much better in um, for personal brands, and there's two types of personal brands. One's like, let's say somebody like me, who I'm a web designer and I'm selling a service in web design, right? And then there's people who actually was the customer themselves. They went through this struggle and they figure out a way, a secret, right? So so for me, for example, I was never my customers. Like a better example would be like, let's say you're an English teacher, but English is your only language that you speak,
hmm,
and you've never went through the pain of learning a new language, right? Like that person cannot tell a hero's journey story because they don't know what it feels like to learn a new language, right? So they have a specific way of telling. They have to tell a story one way, and then for somebody who, and I'll talk about that in a little bit.
hmm,
And then there are people who, let's say, is a foreigner who came to this country and had to learn how to speak English, and now they found a secret to learning English, or they solved the pain, and now I'm going to teach you how to do the same, right? Because I went through this journey myself. So that's kind of like the hero's journey story, which works really well. So this works really well for coaches and people like that who struggle with the problem themselves, but then they found the secret, right? The first kind, which I feel like is mostly freelancers, um, people like the service providers. the story that works well for them is what I call a weakness to strength story. Like,
Yeah.
I used to be this way. So for me, one of my one of my weaknesses that um, I my mom used to always say, "Son, you should never start a business because you're too naive, right? You're gonna lose money because here's an example. Like when I was young, my dad paid me $10 to wash the car, and I spent like 3 hours making like waxing every little detail with Q-tips. I made it perfect, and then I used the $10 that he gave me to go buy a air freshener for the car. So I basically washed the car for free, and then like you know what I mean. And
Yes.
that's an example of why my mom would say like, don't ever start a business, right? But when I started freelancing, what happened was exact the same thing happened. Like my first project was it took me 9 months to make, and they only paid me $2,000, like less than $2,000. So I lost tons of money that year. But then my next project, I only made $3,000, but it actually only took me 3 months. But because I made these two websites like the most amazing websites. The next project was $10,000, and it took me a month, and the next one was $17,000, and so so my weakness actually ended up becoming my biggest strength
Hmm.
because I just wanted to over deliver so much that I was able to keep raising price, raising all the way up to like the highest price we've done for like a basic WordPress site is $200,000. So it's so I usually tell that story, right?
Yeah.
And that's what I call a weakness to strength story, meaning here's my flaw, here's my weakness, and this weakness is so tied to my personality that I can't help myself. This is who I am. But that weakness actually turned out to be my biggest flaw, biggest strength. And when I tell it that way, clients listening will be like, "Oh, yeah, this guy, this is the right guy because he's gonna over deliver no matter what." You know what I mean?
Right, because his mom's voice is still in the back
Yeah,
of his head
exactly.
saying he'll never be successful. "I'll prove you wrong, mom." Um, do you have a system for, capturing stories or, like, story ideas?
Yeah.
Are you yeah?
So this is something I developed within my community. So this
Okay.
is what I mean by what I learned. Because one of the things I realize is that a lot of people have stories, and when they say like these stories are okay, a couple of things. Before I even get into that, I want to just preface
Yeah,
it by
please.
when I ask people to tell me a story. This is usually the story. Oh, I was a lawyer. I had a good job, and I I have a loving husband, and two beautiful kids, but I just wasn't happy. Something I said to myself, there's got to be more to life than this. And one day I just walked into my boss's office. I quit, and then I started my bakery, and like that's kind of the typical story you hear, hero's journey.
Mhm.
But to me, that's not really a story. It's a plot. It's a summary of a story. It's like a synopsis, right?
Yeah.
Like story, like show don't tell, right? Like a story should have like a specific moment where who are you, it should have the who, when, where, and with like what, right? So I say, don't tell me a story, tell me a moment. Tell me like a moment, right? So once I started doing that, people started giving me these moments. In our community we call it examples. And and now once we have that moment, okay, there was this one time, like I'll give you an example. uh, this is from one of our community members. There was this one, like I was on my honeymoon, and one of the things that we had to do was walk up this hiking trail. And the whole time I knew that on the top of the trail there's like a section where you jump off the cliff into the water. And I was like so scared about that the whole time. I was worried. And then when I went there, I stood in front of the cliff, and I looked. And then at that point I was like, oh, should I do it? Should I not do it? Should I do it? And then I did it. And right after I did it, it was like the most amazing moment of my life. I wasn't scared anymore. It felt so good. And okay, now so he'll share a moment like that, right? And then
Mhm.
in a small group we start digging into a little bit more. And one of the things that we do is, what's the lesson of this story, right? And that was, in that case, that was actually pretty simple. It's like, the fear is greater in your head than in reality. That's the lesson.
Definitely.
But another, so that's kind of like, uh that's kind of the system you were telling me about. We just keep track of all the example moments like that, and then everybody has tons of examples like that.
Yeah.
And then in a small group, we try to figure out, okay, what's the lesson of the story, so it can actually become a story. But another one is, we have to. I need to find the trigger, like, because if you just say, "Oh, I was scared, but I did it anyway," it's not.
Right.
Something is missing. Something's,
Nothing happens.
yeah. Like, why did you do it? And when we kept digging and digging, digging, eventually he said, "I was embarrassed because I this is my honeymoon. My new bride is watching me. I didn't want to be the loser, that only loser that doesn't jump off the cliff. So I kept looking back, and just because she was watching, that's what made me do it." And then usually, like, those are the most vulnerable, best part of the story that they leave out. And this is another reason why we probe. And then he's like, and when he said that part, I was like, dude, you left out the best part of the story. Right?
Yes.
So yeah, so that, I think this is why, like you were saying, small groups are so, like,
Yeah. It's so helpful. That's what I'm feeling as you're
yeah,
describing this, is like the community is so important for that skill growth. Do you think that applies to other
yeah.
areas?
I have a feeling that you can apply this to almost any kind of skill that you're learning.
Hmm.
Even if you're like a programmer, maybe you might write a code, you bring it and you share it and get feedback. Another thing that I found is, like, when somebody shares a story, I'm starting to see how universal the human experience is. Like, our communities all over the world, we have members from 100 different countries,
Wow.
and when they share a story, it doesn't matter where you're from, what religion you are, what belief system, what culture, somebody can relate to it.
Yeah.
And as soon as they hear a story, I'm like, oh, that reminds me of this one time in my life. And another story comes out. And then once they do that, somebody else will be like, oh, shit, that reminds me of. And then this is how actually they get story ideas too.
Which is why the story of the guy jumping off the cliff, why that is the most important part of the story, because you don't have to relate to jumping off the cliff, but
Yeah.
so many people can relate to I was embarrassed and didn't want to be
The
viewed this
shame.
way,
Yeah.
yeah, by my wife, and so I did something out of my comfort zone. Like
Yeah.
that's the story, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Besides some of the things we've talked about, like trying to be too complex or overthinking things, what are some of the other common storytelling mistakes you see beginners
Yeah.
make?
So that one. So whenever somebody tells a story for the first time, so
Uh-huh.
I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
So we have a member where I was kind of coaching her one on one, and she told a brilliant story, and I asked her, can you share this story on Sunday service? But when she shared the story, I'm not gonna say who it is. She shared like a watered down version of it. But the thing is, what I found is that the juicy details is where the vulnerability is, and it's actually the best part. So for her, it was she was one day she had nothing to do, and she found that from Instagram, like, all of her friends were going to the beach, but they never invited her.
Mm.
So she kind of felt like left out or whatever. And and then eventually, one of her friend like texted her, hey, like, we're going to the beach, do you want to come? And instead of saying, oh yeah, like, let me come, she said, let me check my schedule, let me see. Right? And then after that, what she did was she went to the beach, like, but not where the friends were, but like
Yeah.
nearby where they can't see, and she waited for the text. Like, and then finally the text came. He's like, I don't know, maybe I'll stop by. And then, so when I told her to retell that story, she left that part out, and you can
Mm.
kind of see why, right? It's a little
Yes.
embarrassing, right? Like, but usually I found that those are so the juicy details is where the vulnerability is at.
Yeah.
And when you share those, that's when people reading it, those tiny little details is when people are like, oh, I so relate to that. And the reason why that it works is because all of us have been in a similar situation like that. but
Yes.
nobody ever says it.
Right. That's exactly why, like,
Yeah,
you're letting us all breathe when you're
yeah,
willing to fall on the sword like that.
uh,
And that's really, you hear vulnerability so much, right? It's almost overstated now, but that's the vulnerability. The courageous thing to do is to, like,
yeah.
be okay with it. I was having a conversation last week about, when somebody gets kind of turned into a meme. They say something silly or whatever, and it just, the people who
Oh
do
yeah,
well through those moments are the ones who can, like, laugh it off and, like, even make fun of
like the Hawk Two
themselves.
girl.
Right. Well, she embraced it, right? But, like,
Yeah.
there are other people that you say something, do you remember the girl Julia Fox from Uncut Gems? Do you remember when she had a
Oh
little,
yeah,
it
yeah,
was
yeah.
like Uncut Gems
Okay, yeah,
or whatever?
yeah.
Well, she embraced it and she, like, said it the next time she was on a red carpet, and everybody
That's awesome.
adored her for it because they'd been making this joke for 2 months,
Yeah.
on TikTok and stuff. And if she tried to hide from it, it's like, people don't embrace that. But if you lean
Yeah.
into it and be like, yeah, I was at the beach, like, that's hilarious. And
Yeah.
I can picture your student, your community member telling that story on stage, and that would get the biggest laugh because
Mhm.
we know what it feels
Mhm.
to do that. And I know why she
Mhm.
left it out, but that, you're
Mhm.
right. That part is hilarious.
Yeah, so that we always try to find those little moments, like the
Yeah.
juicy details that we're afraid to say, but we keep probing.
Are you familiar with Matthew Dix and his work? He has a book called
No.
Storyworthy. He's like a moth grand champion.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And he wrote a book called Storyworthy and a few others. And he was talking about stories in general, not just stories for marketing. But his theory is that every story rather, can be reduced to a 5-second moment, one moment that is really the
Mhm.
encapsulation of the whole story.
Yeah.
And ever since he said that, I hear you kind of echoing it now. Like,
Yeah.
I've really always thought
I
about
didn't
that
even I
moment.
haven't even heard of that. I call it 5 second moment because
Do
it's
you?
funny. I'm like, we call it 5 second moment, but
Oh, wow.
this is
Yeah,
the
check.
first time I'm hearing of that.
He's been on the show. His name is Matthew Dix, and he's like, he wins almost every moth competition that he does.
Oh,
But
nice.
the book that I read first that made me invite him to the show was Storyworthy. So cool. He's great. You definitely should check out his work. I think
Yeah,
you would dig
I'll
him a
check it
lot. But
out.
it makes me think of those, like, the macro story is really about the micro moment, you
Mhm.
know. And
Yeah.
so that really resonates. Question before we leave: um, in your journey, who are the people that shaped your perspective and your mindset the most?
Hmm. That's a good question.
You have a pretty
I
clear.
feel like I feel like I shift. I jump from boat to boat. Like I jump ship. Like like in the beginning, I love Gary Vee, but then I got kind of tired of him after
That
a
sounds
while,
familiar.
and then I'll jump onto the next. And I think the reason why is because when you're, and it's why, like, in the beginning days, those huge influencers that have big mainstream audiences, they're usually for the beginners, right? So if let's say you first go into into a spiritual or self-help world, you
Hmm.
might be like, oh, Tony Robbins or something like that,
Yeah.
and then you learn all of that stuff, and it just sounds like cliche. And then now you got to find somebody who's a little bit more of an expert, who has a smaller audience and smaller, and I think it goes up like that. So that's kind of what happened to me. But like, I guess I guess there's different things, right? There's people that I admire for, like, you know mindset stuff, and there's people for, like, you know like storytelling. And then,
Hmm.
so, I really love Chuck Palahniuk. Do you know Chuck
Yeah.
Palahniuk? Yeah.
Sure.
So I think a lot of the vulnerability, those, like, little digging into your shadow and really getting that stuff out, I think I got from him. um I Jordan Peterson is somebody that I've never gotten sick of him yet. Like, because most of these people that I follow, after like a couple years,
Right.
I'm kind of over it. But, like, I've been following Jordan Peterson for a while, and his content really intrigues me. Like the way he explains, like, he has those videos where he talks about the Disney movies,
Hmm.
and, like he breaks down, like, the story in Disney movies. Like, I love those. Um, when it comes to, like, leadership, I really love Jocko Willink. I
Yeah.
don't know. He's like a Navy SEAL guy, but
Yeah,
I've
yeah.
learned a lot about like leadership and like how to manage people and things like that from him. Yeah, so like I guess a bunch of different people.
Right on. And one thing the folks listening can do to improve their storytelling skills today.
Here's the one thing that a huge mistake that I didn't cover today, which is I it's called inner transformation, but I don't say it like that because people don't know what that means. I say this: when you tell a story and there's no old you versus new you don't have a story. And so many people tell stories like that where they'll be like, "Oh, when I was young, like everybody doubted me, but I worked hard and I proved them wrong, and I proved them wrong. So like, don't give up." And that's the lesson of the story. I'm like, doesn't sound like you didn't actually learn any lesson there. There's no old. It looks like you were dope back then, and you're still dope today, right? And that's how you know it's not a story. And it's actually
Right.
stories that like that usually is coming from a trauma. It means that they've
Mm,
never got. It means I'm only doing this to prove them wrong. Like that's a traumatic.
yeah,
That's a story of trauma, right?
that's a good point.
Maybe you need to get to a point where you don't need to prove anyone wrong, right? Like, so I usually say when you tell a story and there's no old you versus new you, there's no story, and most likely you're still telling a story from a place of trauma.
Hmm. Whew. That's deep, brother. I love it, man. Perfect place to end. Son, I appreciate your time so much, man. I really respect what you've done with Night Owls and the Night Owl Nation. Thanks for being here, man.
Thank you so much for having me.